What if the person the world believes is guilty was never alone in that house? That was the question burning through headlines, igniting social media feeds, and cracking the very foundation of trust in one of Hollywood's most beloved families. Rob Reiner, a name synonymous with legacy, laughter, and layered storytelling. The man who gave the world The Princess Bride, A Few Good Men, and When Harry Met Sally. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Michelle Singer Reiner, a quietly powerful force in the Reiner dynasty, an activist, a screenwriter, a woman whose elegance was rivaled only by her fierce protectiveness of her family. Both found butchered, stabbed to death, in the master bedroom of their $13.5 million Brentwood estate. The kind of scene that's usually reserved for a movie. Only this wasn't fiction. And the person sitting in the back of the police cruiser that night? Their son, Nick Reiner, 32, a struggling screenwriter. A man who once overdosed on heroin at 19 and spent years clawing his way out of addiction and obscurity, only to find himself handcuffed, soaked in blood, and shoved into the media spotlight. A son, a suspect, a killer? That's what the world thought. Until now. Because Nick has broken his silence. And what he says changes everything. Let's rewind. It was supposed to be a quiet Sunday evening. The kind where nothing much happens in Brentwood, unless you count the latest feud between bored billionaires over hedge heights or recycling bins. Rob and Michelle were known to be home. No parties. No staff reported working late. No alarm sounded. Yet by 10:32 p.m., police sirens pierced the silence. What had happened inside those walls would stun even the most hardened detectives. 2 bodies. Multiple stab wounds. No signs of forced entry. And only one other person reportedly on the premises. Nick. He lived in the guest house, a structure separated from the main estate by a manicured path and just enough shrubbery to pretend there were boundaries. When officers arrived, they found Nick disoriented, shaking, barefoot, and blood-stained. Not running, not resisting, just sitting, mumbling something. Something about someone else being there. Someone they didn't see. That detail didn't make the initial reports. It wasn't in the early press releases, but it was heard by one of the officers, and it was written down. He said someone else was in the house. He said, "I know who did this." Now, let's be honest. In most murder cases, the person closest to the victims is the first to be questioned. In this case, the only one physically on site. The one with the troubled past. The one with the motive the tabloids could easily manufacture. Resentment, financial desperation, emotional breakdown. But from the beginning, something never quite added up. No defensive wounds on Nick. No bloody footprints leading away from the house. And most importantly, no murder weapon found on him. But no one wanted to hear that. Because by morning, the headlines had already printed their verdict. Reiner's son arrested in Hollywood horror. Legendary director and wife slain by troubled air. From silver spoon to bloody hands. Nick Reiner in custody. Case closed. Or so they thought. But then came Romy. Romy Reiner, the youngest of the Reiner children. 27. Artist. Filmmaker. Often out of the spotlight, until that night. She was the one who found them. She was the one who called 911. And she was the one who reportedly whispered to the officers, "He's not the only one you should be looking at." That line didn't just rattle detectives. It blew the entire case wide open. Who was she referring to? Why had she never spoken publicly? Why had she gone quiet immediately after the funeral, vanishing from social media, canceling every appearance, and refusing all interviews? Until now. Because sources confirm, Romy has turned over a folder to authorities. Inside, surveillance screenshots, voice memos, journal entries, and a name. But before we get to that, let's talk about the timeline. According to police records, the murders occurred between 8:45 and 9:30 p.m. Nick Reiner placed a call to a friend at 9:39 p.m. Reportedly panicked, incoherent, and crying. By 9:51 p.m., neighbors heard shouting. By 10 p.m., Romy pulled into the driveway. By 10:05 p.m., she screamed. The screams were recorded on a neighbor's ring cam. By 10:32 p.m., LAPD was on site. And at 11:12 p.m., Nick Reiner was in custody. Blood on his hands. But not a drop of it explained. No murder weapon on his body. No cuts on his hands. Strange, isn't it? The autopsy report lists multiple sharp force injuries as the cause of death. But the exact phrasing on the coroner's findings? Laceration patterns inconsistent with a single assailant. Wait, what? Why wasn't that part of the media coverage? Why didn't that line make it into any of the press briefings? Because it changes everything. If the wounds were inconsistent with one attacker, who was the second? And what if the person responsible was already gone before police even arrived? What if Nick wasn't stalling, but stalling for them? Nick Reiner's silence in the days after his arrest was deafening. His legal team kept tight control. No statements, no bail, no appearances, and that suited the narrative just fine. It's easier when the villain doesn't speak. But then he did. Yesterday, for the first time since the murders, Nick Reiner addressed the public in a raw, unedited 19-minute audio message posted to his attorney's secure site and leaked within hours. In his own words, he said, "I didn't kill them. But I know who did, and I know why." He went on to describe a presence in the house that night. A person whose name he still refuses to say, for now. He claimed he was afraid that the truth is more twisted than anyone can imagine. He described hearing a voice, a familiar voice, not his mother, not his father, someone else. He claims he walked into the aftermath, not the crime. And when he tried to help, he was threatened. But here's the kicker. He says he has proof. Proof that was hidden inside a locked safe. A safe only Rob Reiner had the code to. And now, that safe is missing. Removed from the home within hours of the crime. Vanished. No trace. No official record of its existence. Only a receipt from a delivery service dated 6 years earlier when it was installed. No one reported it stolen. No one even mentioned it. Until Nick did. And here's the question. Why would someone remove a safe, but leave behind a suspect? We are entering a story far bigger than one man's guilt or innocence. We are entering a story filled with family fractures, secret recordings, Hollywood power plays, inheritance disputes, and a trail of evidence that leads away from the only person behind bars. Is Nick Reiner a monster? Or a scapegoat? A killer? Or a witness no one believed? And what happens when the truth starts bleeding through the lies? Because Nick Reiner says he knows who was in the house. And now, so will you. But what comes next will change everything. And no one, not even Nick, saw it coming. What actually happened that night? Was it the culmination of years of tension, hidden resentments, and unspoken fears? Or was it a meticulously planned act by someone with motives no one could even imagine? The answers lie within the walls of the Brentwood estate, where luxury and horror collided in the early hours of a Sunday evening. Let's start at the beginning. It was supposed to be a quiet night. No guests, no events, no Hollywood drama beyond the usual tabloid whispers. Rob and Michelle had stayed in for dinner, a rare moment of normalcy in a life otherwise dictated by cameras, scripts, and schedules. Meanwhile, Nick Reiner was in the guest house, a modest but elegant structure that sat a few dozen feet from the main mansion. Friends described him as quiet that evening, introspective, scrolling through his phone, occasionally pacing. He had spent weeks working on a screenplay, isolated from the family, but not completely disconnected. Neighbors would later report seeing lights flicker across the property at odd intervals, shadows moving in ways that suggested someone was restless, someone unsettled. And then, around 8:45 p.m., everything changed. The first scream came at approximately 9:03 p.m. It was muffled, tense, almost rehearsed. A scream that didn't just pierce the night. It seemed to echo through the estate, bouncing off the manicured hedges and pristine walls like a warning. No one answered immediately. Security cameras captured nothing conclusive. Motion sensors recorded minor movements, but nothing alarming. The kind of readings that, on any other night, would have been dismissed. But on this night, every movement mattered. Every detail was a clue waiting to be discovered. By 9:15 p.m., Romy Reiner arrived at the estate. She had been visiting friends nearby and, feeling a strange unease, decided to check in on her parents. What she found would haunt her forever. The front door was ajar. The hallways were dark. A faint scent of iron, metallic, unmistakable, hung in the air. And then, in the master bedroom, the scene that would define the night. Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner. Both motionless. Both stabbed multiple times. Blood pooled around them, a stark contrast against the expensive Persian rugs. Romy screamed. The neighbors called 911. And in that instant, Nick Reiner's world collided with law enforcement in the most dramatic way imaginable. Nick was discovered in the guest house around 10:32 p.m., barefoot, trembling, and with visible blood stains on his clothing. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't fleeing. He was sitting on a couch, muttering to himself. "Someone else was here," he reportedly said. "I didn't do this. I know who did." The officers, trained to assess risk and threat, were immediately suspicious. A son of the victims, present on the property, with a history of drug use and rehabilitation, the narrative practically wrote itself. But Nick's demeanor was not that of a typical perpetrator. There were no defensive wounds, no fresh cuts on his hands, no obvious evidence tying him directly to the murders. The inconsistencies didn't end there. The timeline, reconstructed later by investigators, was confounding. 8:45 p.m., last confirmed sighting of Rob and Michelle alive. 9:03 p.m., first scream heard in the estate. 9:15 p.m., Romy arrives at the property. 9:39 p.m., Nick makes a panic call to a friend. 9:51 p.m., neighbors report hearing shouting. 10:05 p.m., Romy discovers the bodies. 10:32 p.m., LAPD arrives. 11:12 p.m., Nick is taken into custody. What this timeline suggests is chilling. Someone had time to enter, commit the crime, and leave before Nick was able to intervene. But who? The murder weapon, a chef's knife reportedly taken from the Reiner's personal collection, was missing from the scene. That absence alone raised questions. How could a murder take place with no weapon found on the supposed killer? And then there was the blood spatter. Forensic analysts would later note patterns inconsistent with a single assailant, patterns that suggested the involvement of someone else, someone moving in coordination, someone who knew the layout intimately. Nick, of course, insisted he had seen someone. He claimed he had been present, but not the attacker. He described hearing voices, movements, and footsteps that didn't belong to him or his parents. The authorities were skeptical. The media called him a liar. The public had already decided. But a small number of investigators quietly noted that his account, while improbable, could not be dismissed outright. Meanwhile, Romy's 911 call painted another layer of complexity. She told dispatchers that there was a dangerous family member who should also be considered a suspect. That line was overlooked in early media coverage, but has since become a central piece of the puzzle. Who was she referring to? A cousin? A distant relative? Someone else entirely? The implications were staggering. If Romy's warning was accurate, then the entire narrative surrounding Nick as the lone perpetrator was fundamentally flawed. Public reaction was immediate. Social media erupted with theories, accusations, and memes, the kind of attention reserved for celebrity scandals. Comment sections filled with "he did it" posts. News networks cycled between sympathetic coverage of Nick's troubled past and sensational headlines about Hollywood horror. But the truth was far more layered, far more nuanced. Nick's previous history, rehab, struggles with addiction, mental health challenges, became both a weapon and a shield in the public eye. For some, it made him more likely to commit the crime. For others, it made him more likely to be framed. And that is precisely what Nick claimed. He maintained that he was being set up, that someone else was in the house, and that the police were unknowingly focusing on the wrong suspect. Then there were the neighbors. Quiet, wealthy, observant. They reported seeing a figure in the estate's backyard shortly before the bodies were discovered. The description was vague. Tall, dark clothing, moving deliberately. No one thought to call authorities at the time, assuming it was a staff member or a family friend. But in retrospect, that figure became a critical lead. Could it have been the actual killer? Or was it someone setting the stage, knowing Nick's presence would make him appear guilty? The questions multiplied faster than answers could emerge. And as if the night hadn't already delivered enough shocks, the press uncovered yet another detail. A missing safe. A safe installed years earlier in the Reiner's home, one that supposedly contained sensitive documents, personal journals, and financial records. Nick mentioned the safe in his initial statements, claiming someone removed it shortly before the bodies were found. Was it a coincidence? Or was it part of a calculated plan? The estate itself became a character in this story. Security systems disabled at irregular intervals. Motion sensors triggered with no corresponding recordings. Doors left unlocked. Windows suspiciously clean, as if someone had prepared the scene in advance. All of it contributed to an unsettling narrative. This was not a random crime of passion. This was deliberate, calculated, strategic. And yet, the human element remained. Nick's emotional state during his arrest was one of confusion, fear, and disbelief. Witnesses describe him as shaking, on the verge of tears, unable to process that he had been immediately branded a killer. How does someone reconcile the weight of accusation with the knowledge of their own innocence? How does a son process the brutal loss of both parents, knowing the world thinks he is the cause? The psychological tension here is palpable, and it's only the beginning. Because as we delve deeper into the case, you'll find more contradictions, more inconsistencies, more evidence that points in directions no one expected. And perhaps most importantly, you'll see that the story of that night, the night that changed everything, is far from over. Because the person Nick says was actually in the house has not yet been publicly identified. And the truth? It's more twisted than anyone could imagine. But what comes next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What does it mean when a man accused of the most horrific crime imaginable speaks for the first time, and doesn't deny being at the scene, but insists he isn't the killer? Nick Reiner's statement, delivered through his attorney in a controlled release, was exactly that, a confession without confessing, a challenge to everything the world had assumed about him. It began simply, almost too calmly for the magnitude of the accusation. I was there. I saw it happen. I tried to stop it. I couldn't. And now everyone thinks I'm the one who did it. But I didn't. Someone else was in the house that night. Those words would immediately become the lightning rod of the case. Media outlets dissected them. Social media exploded. Experts debated. How could a person so intimately involved with the victim's claim innocence so emphatically? And yet, there was something in his tone, in the cracks of his voice, that suggested he meant it. Let's examine the context. Nick had been living in the guest house for months prior to the murders. Friends described him as withdrawn but not violent. Observers noted he spent hours alone, sometimes pacing, sometimes talking quietly to himself. He had a history of substance abuse, a fact that would become central to the narrative, but those close to him insisted he had been sober for over a year. The night of the murders, according to his account, he had been upstairs in his private quarters, reviewing notes for a screenplay. He heard a commotion from the main house, and, concerned, stepped outside to investigate. And then he saw them. His parents. Lifeless. Blood pooling. The scene that would define his life forever. He claims he was paralyzed by shock at first, frozen by the horror of seeing his parents in that condition. And then he noticed movement, not his own, not theirs. Someone else. Someone whose presence he couldn't immediately explain. Nick's recounting of the events included details that would later puzzle investigators. He described footsteps that didn't match his stride, shadows that fell in impossible angles, voices that weren't his parents. In other words, a witness, yes, but one who couldn't be fully believed, according to the skeptics. And here is the contradiction that would dominate discussions for days. Nick was present at the scene, yet his fingerprints were limited to areas consistent with a shocked bystander, not a perpetrator. His DNA was found on some objects, sure, but nothing definitive tied him to the knife wounds. Could he have been framing himself, some asked? Or being framed? Others countered. Nick himself insisted on the latter. He stated, repeatedly, that someone else had orchestrated the scene to make him appear guilty. Someone who knew him, knew his habits, knew the family. He didn't stop there. He described a struggle, not with his parents, but with this unseen person. A fight that no one else could corroborate. He described hearing threats, whispered warnings that if he interfered, he would become the next victim. He also claimed that this person left behind evidence meant to point directly to him. A trail of items, strategically placed, a staged timeline designed to make the police believe he acted alone. Think about that for a moment. A killer sophisticated enough to stage a scene, intimate enough to know Nick's vulnerabilities, and audacious enough to leave him alive as the fall guy. It's cinematic. It's unbelievable. And yet, Nick says it happened. The confession continued with the most shocking element, the safe. Nick revealed that he had been aware of a locked safe in the main house, one his father had installed years earlier. A safe that contained sensitive materials, personal journals, and documents relating to the family's finances. According to Nick, the safe had been tampered with, accessed, and removed before police arrived. Someone had known the exact combination, had known the exact timing, and had intended to erase the family's records, all while framing Nick. This added a layer of intrigue no one could ignore. The safe was now missing, the documents were gone, and Nick had no way of proving the contents existed. It was evidence of a meticulous, premeditated plan. Then came the most cryptic part of his statement. Nick referred to a voice he recognized, though he could not publicly name it. A voice that had orchestrated events in ways he could only partially describe. He claimed he heard the voice giving instructions, hearing it in the corridors, hearing it over the phone. Was it a hallucination? Was it paranoia? Or was it truth? Psychologists would later argue that someone under immense stress could fabricate such memories. But others countered. If someone had meticulously framed him, would he not describe such a presence? Nick did, and he described it in painstaking detail. The way the person moved, the objects they touched, the way the lights flickered, the way they ensured that all eyes would be on him by the time Romy arrived. It was too specific, too deliberate. The media response was predictable. Headlines screamed betrayal, dysfunction, and tragedy. Tabloids ran timeline of terror, stories that portrayed Nick as unstable and dangerous. Comment sections filled with viewers debating whether a troubled son could truly be innocent. But inside the legal team's strategy room, a different discussion took place. Every detail he gives that matches the scene is a double-edged sword. One attorney reportedly said, on one hand, he's incriminating himself by being present. On the other, he's providing information that only someone there could know. And if he's lying, how does he know that? It was a delicate balance. The confession was a trap for everyone watching. Nick also alluded to his parents' awareness of the dangerous presence. He suggested that Rob and Michelle might have suspected someone close to the family was planning something. He said they had warned him not to confront anyone alone. And here is where the story becomes even more tangled. Romy, the youngest Reiner, had made cryptic statements to authorities that she had warned about a dangerous family member. Was Nick referencing the same person? Did Romy know more than she was letting on? The police, confronted with two narratives, Nick's version and Romy's warning, were suddenly in uncharted territory. They had an accused son, a potential insider threat, and no clear evidence pointing to anyone else. Nick concluded his statement with a haunting line. The truth is more twisted than anyone can imagine. I am not the villain, but I am trapped in a story written by someone who wanted me here, in handcuffs, while they walked free. You will see it soon. Those words hung in the air like smoke in a room after a fire. And then came silence. For days, the public waited. Did Nick have proof? Would Romy corroborate his story? Would authorities uncover the presence of the mysterious individual he described? Meanwhile, every angle was dissected. Nick's past behavior, his substance abuse history, the family dynamics, security footage gaps, the missing safe. Every piece pointed in multiple directions, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. And the most pressing question remained. If Nick didn't do it, then who did? The confession, without confessing, left the world in suspense. Everyone had a theory. No one had the truth. Nick had changed the narrative entirely, forcing the world to question its assumptions. He was not the story's villain, but he was the only one in the narrative so far, making his words, his account, and his insistence on innocence the first real twist in a case already full of them. And just when the world thought it had reached the edge of disbelief, Nick hinted at something even deeper, evidence hidden, a puzzle incomplete, a secret only he could reveal. The confession had been made, yes, but the full story? That had yet to emerge. But what came next would shock even those who had already dismissed him. What do you do when the walls themselves seem to be keeping secrets? In the Reiner estate, secrets weren't just hidden in safes or diaries. Some were built into the very architecture, waiting silently for the right moment to be revealed. Nick Reiner's guest house, where he had lived for the months leading up to the murders, was one of those secrets. To the casual observer, it was a modest yet elegant structure. Whitewashed walls, large glass windows, and a minimalist interior design befitting a Hollywood heir trying to carve his own identity. But to those who knew, it was something else entirely. It contained a room that wasn't on any official blueprint. A hidden space accessed through a cleverly disguised door in the study. A door that looked like a bookshelf. And it wasn't just any room. Nick, in later interviews and leaked recordings, described the space in detail. He said it was soundproofed, equipped with monitors, and lined with shelves that held everything from old family photographs to audio recordings he claimed were of conversations within the main house. Why would a 32-year-old need a secret room like this? According to Nick, it wasn't about secrecy for secrecy's sake. He said he had been collecting information, not just about his parents, but about tensions within the family, disputes, arguments, threats that went unreported. He described the room as his safety net, a place where he could observe without being observed. Neighbors had long suspected something unusual about the guest house. Lights often flickered late at night. Sometimes, from a distance, shadows would move in the windows even when Nick wasn't supposed to be awake. Some claimed to hear whispers carried by the wind. None of these observations were reported until after the murders. At the time, people simply assumed Nick was eccentric, another child of wealth behaving strangely. But after the crime, the secret room became a critical piece of the puzzle. Forensic teams, once allowed to enter, found a series of audio recordings. Some were conversations overheard from the main house. Others were audio files labeled with dates and times, seemingly documenting private arguments between family members. And then there were the recordings Nick refused to explain. Cryptic messages, voices not belonging to anyone he named publicly, sounds of doors opening and closing when no one was supposed to be home. Could this room have been key to what happened the night of the murders? Nick claimed that the monitors captured movements in the main house hours before the killings. Shadows that didn't belong to him or his parents. Someone entering the estate at an unusual hour. Someone leaving shortly before Romy arrived. And here's the detail that set investigators on edge. Some of the recordings suggested that the perpetrator knew exactly how to manipulate Nick's presence. The person moved in patterns that would put Nick in the guest house at critical moments, ensuring that all eyes would fall on him. It was meticulous, calculated, deliberate. The existence of the secret room also raised questions about Nick's awareness. Was he truly a passive observer that night, as he claimed? Or had he been monitoring the main house for days, anticipating a confrontation he hadn't expected? Nick insisted he was not involved in the violence. But his knowledge of the room, the monitors, and the movements within the house gave him insight that few could have. And the authorities noticed. They began to consider the possibility that someone had been using Nick's surveillance as a tool to stage the crime and frame him. Inside the room, investigators found journals. Nick had written extensively about what he observed. Arguments between his parents and other family members, disputes over finances, rumors of an outsider visiting the estate, and hints of a long-standing family feud. Some entries were mundane, detailing dinner plans or screenplay ideas. Others were chilling. Notes about people acting suspiciously, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and warnings about someone who shouldn't be trusted. It became clear that Nick had been aware of tensions that may have contributed to the tragic night. But was he a passive chronicler or a participant in events larger than himself? The room also contained a small safe, distinct from the one in the main house. It held digital files, encrypted documents, video recordings, and audio files that Nick claimed contained proof of the real perpetrator. When investigators tried to access the files, they encountered sophisticated encryption. Only Nick, it seemed, could unlock them. And he refused, citing safety concerns and fear for his own life. The secrecy only fueled public speculation. Critics argued that Nick's insistence on withholding evidence was suspicious. Supporters countered that he was protecting himself from a dangerous family member, someone who may have orchestrated the murders and wanted him to take the fall. The room itself became a symbol of the story's complexity. On the one hand, it demonstrated Nick's intelligence and resourcefulness. On the other, it suggested paranoia. A man living in a house where every corner, every shadow, could harbor a threat. And in Hollywood, where perception often trumps reality, the existence of a hidden room painted Nick in a light that was both sympathetic and incriminating. Complicating matters further were neighbors' accounts of strange activity near the guest house in the weeks leading up to the murders. People reported seeing figures entering and exiting the property at odd hours. One neighbor claimed to have seen a car parked near the estate, with headlights off, for nearly an hour late at night. Nick, in his recordings, noted these occurrences. He described trying to confront the intruder or at least identify them, but the person always vanished before he could get a clear view. Was this the same person who would later commit the murders? Or someone else entirely, connected to a deeper conspiracy within the family? And then there was the matter of the monitors themselves. Footage from cameras in and around the main house showed anomalies. Lights turning on and off, doors opening when no one was present, and shadows moving in ways that defied logic. Nick claimed that these anomalies were not glitches, but evidence of tampering. Someone was actively manipulating the surveillance, creating an environment where he could appear guilty while the true perpetrator moved unseen. The secret room also revealed another unsettling fact. Nick had documented every visit, argument, and strange occurrence for months. His notes included detailed descriptions of voices, footsteps, and interactions that no one else could verify. To the authorities, this made Nick a key witness, potentially the only one capable of identifying the real culprit. But to the public, it made him seem obsessive, paranoid, and dangerous. And in the weeks that followed, the tension only grew. Investigators began to piece together a disturbing possibility. The person who committed the murders may have known about the secret room all along. They may have been aware of Nick's surveillance, manipulated it to their advantage, and ensured that Nick would be the primary suspect when the bodies were discovered. If true, it would mean that the entire case, as it had been reported, was a lie. A lie carefully constructed to hide the real story. A story that Nick had only begun to tell. The secret room, the monitors, the journals, the encrypted files. They all pointed to one truth. This was no simple case of a son killing his parents. It was a labyrinth of deceit, surveillance, and manipulation, with Nick trapped in the center. And the most terrifying part? The room contained hints of a presence that had not yet been identified. A person who had planned, executed, and orchestrated events with precision. Someone who may still be watching. Someone who may have set Nick up from the very beginning. But what came next would reveal just how deep the deception went, and how close Nick had been to uncovering the truth before tragedy struck. Who do you trust when the danger comes from inside your own bloodline? For Rob Reiner, that question haunted her long before the night her parents were murdered. She had long suspected that someone in her family harbored a darkness no one dared acknowledge. A darkness that could turn from whispered threats to real violence in an instant. And she wasn't wrong. It was Romy who discovered the bodies, the horror seared into her memory forever. But before that, she had made a call to authorities. Not about Nick, not about her parents, but about someone she warned could be a threat. She had said, in her 911 transcript, "There's someone in this family who is dangerous. They should be a suspect." That line would initially be ignored. Media outlets obsessed over Nick, the troubled son, and painted Romy's statement as vague and unsubstantiated. But inside law enforcement, her words were taken seriously, because Romy knew things others didn't. The dangerous family member she referenced had a history. They were unpredictable, charismatic, often charming, yet capable of sudden rage. Friends of the family described them as volatile, someone whose temper could shift like a storm, whose intentions were often unclear. Romy had seen this person lash out in ways small but telling. Arguments over finances escalating to threats, private confrontations that left family members shaken. And for months, she had recorded these incidents in private journals, carefully documenting behaviors that suggested someone in the Reiner family had the capacity for real violence. Investigators soon discovered that in the weeks leading up to the murders, tensions between this family member and Rob and Michelle had escalated. Private emails hinted at disputes over money, inheritance, and personal grudges. Conversations overheard on audio recordings suggested threats. Subtle but pointed, veiled as jokes or warnings. It painted a chilling picture. A simmering resentment boiling under the surface, a grudge waiting for the right moment to erupt. Nick's statements corroborated some of Romy's fears. In his recordings, he mentioned hearing arguments in the house that didn't involve him, voices raised in anger, and threats thrown across rooms that would later take on deadly significance. He insisted that he had no part in these confrontations. that he was merely a witness to the buildup of tension. But the dangerous family member he referenced was omnipresent in his descriptions. Someone whose influence over events that night could not be understated. Police began investigating this person's whereabouts on the night of the murders. They discovered inconsistencies in their alibi, travel records that didn't match statements, text messages deleted or altered, and neighbors recalled seeing someone leaving the estate around the time the screams were heard. Someone who wasn't Nick, Romy, or the victims. Suddenly, the investigation expanded beyond the initial assumption that Nick acted alone. Financial motives added another layer of intrigue. The Reiners' estate was substantial, $13.5 million, plus other assets hidden in trusts. Disputes over inheritance, according to private documents obtained by investigators, had caused friction within the family for years. The dangerous family member had the most to gain if the Reiners were gone, and the least to lose if suspicion fell on Nick. It was a perfect setup, someone willing, able, and calculating enough to orchestrate a crime while ensuring the blame landed squarely on the son. Romy had always feared that this person was capable of something terrible. She had confided her concerns to close friends, noting that her father, despite his calm exterior, had begun taking precautions, installing new locks, security systems, even keeping a journal of unusual activity. But those precautions were insufficient against someone who knew the house, knew the family, and knew Nick well enough to manipulate him. Forensic teams later noted evidence that suggested multiple entries and exits from the house that night. Footprints inconsistent with Nick's shoe size. Fingerprints on doorknobs not matching anyone in the household. Security camera footage tampered with in specific windows and angles. It was as if the house itself had been a stage for someone meticulously planning to frame Nick. Romy's revelations would later become central to the defense's strategy. Her warnings about the dangerous family member suggested premeditation, motive, and opportunity. Three critical elements in any criminal investigation. And yet, her identity remained protected for months. For safety. For fear of retribution. She was the first to see what many would call the invisible hand behind the tragedy. The dangerous family member had also left subtle signs, messages, notes, and digital footprints, suggesting awareness of Nick's surveillance. The secret room, the monitors, the journals, all could have been observed or manipulated by someone with access. In other words, the very tools Nick used to defend himself may have been used against him. But who exactly was this person? And why would they want both Rob and Michelle dead? Investigators theorized a combination of factors: financial gain from inheritance and trusts, personal grudges against the Reiners for perceived slights or control, opportunity, knowing the family's routines and security vulnerabilities. Combined, these factors created a perfect storm. A crime designed not just to kill, but to mislead. The psychological dimension cannot be understated. A dangerous family member operating in such a calculated way requires patience, intelligence, and a willingness to exploit the emotional bonds of the victims. Nick's account suggested he was aware of these dynamics. He described past incidents where this person had tested boundaries, attempted to manipulate his parents, and subtly threatened him. The warning Romy gave to police, that someone dangerous existed within the family, was now substantiated by multiple lines of evidence. And yet, public perception remained fixed on Nick. Why? Because it is easier to blame the son with a troubled past than to confront the unsettling reality. Sometimes, the danger comes from the people you think you can trust. Sometimes, the murderer isn't a stranger. Sometimes, the hand that harms you belongs to your own family. Romy's journals, Nick's recordings, and the forensic evidence all pointed in one direction, towards someone within the family circle. But the identity remained hidden. A shadow in the background. A silent threat. The dangerous family member theory transformed the case. It reframed the narrative from a single-son tragedy to a multi-layered mystery. It suggested premeditation, manipulation, and deception beyond what anyone had imagined. And for Nick, it provided both hope and peril. Hope that the truth might eventually exonerate him. Peril because the person responsible was still at large, someone who had demonstrated cunning, patience, and ruthlessness. But what happened next? Who was this person? How close they were to the victims? And what their ultimate motive was? would shock even those who had doubted Nick's innocence from the start. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. But one piece remained elusive, the one that would change everything. And no one had found it yet. What if the person everyone assumes is guilty has spent years fighting demons no one can see? Nick Reiner's life wasn't defined by privilege alone. It was defined by struggle, private, painful, and meticulously hidden from the bright lights of Hollywood. And understanding that struggle is crucial to understanding the events that would unfold that night. Long before the murders, Nick had a life full of highs and lows that few outside the family understood. Born into a dynasty of Hollywood legends, he carried both a name and expectations heavier than most could bear. Friends recall a boy who excelled in charm and intellect but was burdened by an invisible pressure to live up to his father's towering reputation, to maintain the family image, and to remain unflinching in the face of personal turmoil. By his late teens, Nick's life had taken a darker turn. The combination of early exposure to fame, easy access to substances, and unrelenting pressure pushed him toward addiction. By age 19, he had suffered his first overdose. It was a private moment, hidden from the press, but it marked the beginning of years spent in and out of rehab facilities across the country. To outsiders, rehab might look like an attempt to fix a problem. To Nick, it was a battleground. A place where he wrestled not just with drugs, but with mental health, trauma, and a sense of identity lost under the weight of his last name. He spent months in facilities that were quiet, structured, and highly controlled. He learned to manage his impulses, to rebuild his life step by step. But those who knew him well understood that sobriety was a constant struggle, a daily fight that required vigilance and support. The narrative of Nick as the troubled son played perfectly into the public's assumptions about the murders. Headlines immediately described him as unstable, troubled, and at risk for violence. Tabloids portrayed rehab stints as evidence of an inherently dangerous individual. But here's the contradiction. While the media painted him as someone incapable of control, those who had worked with Nick in rehabilitation consistently described a young man who was self-aware, reflective, and deeply committed to change. It was almost as if the world refused to see the full picture. Nick's rehab experiences also gave him insights into human behavior. He became acutely aware of manipulation, deception, and the ways people can hide their intentions. Friends recall him saying, "I know how people operate when they're desperate, when they want to control the story." Those words would later take on new significance. Because the night of his parents' murders, Nick described a scenario that matched the kind of calculated planning he had learned to recognize in rehab programs: premeditated, strategic, and manipulative. Beyond rehab, Nick attempted to build a creative life of his own. He took screenwriting courses, collaborated on independent projects, and even had brief stints on sets of his father's productions. But Hollywood is not kind to the sons of legends, especially those with troubled histories. Doors closed, opportunities vanished, and resentment simmered quietly, unspoken, unacknowledged by outsiders. He described this period of his life as a form of exile. Forced to live in the guest house, removed from the main house, observing family dynamics without fully participating in them. And it was here, in isolation, that he began documenting everything: the secret room, the audio recordings, the interactions, and the patterns of behavior that others might overlook. The world would later see Nick's rehab history as a liability, a mark against his credibility. But in reality, it may have been his greatest strength. He had learned patience, observation, and discretion, skills that, ironically, may have allowed him to survive the night of the murders. He knew how to notice details, how to remain calm under scrutiny, and how to interpret behaviors that might otherwise be dismissed. In many ways, his other life gave him an edge that no one could see, an edge that was about to become critical in understanding the true events of that fateful evening. Yet the shadow of Hollywood never left him. The industry, obsessed with legacies, looked at Nick and saw a cautionary tale. A son who couldn't live up to the family name, who had made mistakes, who had been publicly humiliated by private struggles leaked to gossip outlets. These pressures, combined with his isolation in the guest house, created a perfect storm for misunderstanding. One wrong step, one misinterpreted movement, one scream in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the public narrative was set: Nick Reiner was guilty. But Nick insisted that the story was far more complex. He spoke of being aware that someone else had planned the murder, someone who understood his history and knew exactly how to exploit it to make him the scapegoat. There's another layer here that often gets overlooked: the emotional weight. Rehab teaches skills, but it does not erase pain. It does not erase grief, fear, or guilt over past actions. Nick's life had been punctuated by trauma, some self-inflicted, some external. That night, as he witnessed the aftermath of the murders, he described a paralysis, not from guilt, but from shock. From recognition that the person responsible was still at large. From the terrifying awareness that his own past could be used against him, framing him as the villain in a story he did not write. His rehab experiences also made him highly attuned to signs of deception. He noted inconsistencies in timelines, suspicious behavior from people around the estate, and unusual movements that didn't match anyone's typical routine. And in his recordings, Nick referenced these observations. He had been documenting everything for months: who came to the house, who left, who spoke in hushed tones, and who had access to the main estate. These observations would later become crucial in constructing his defense and in identifying the true dangerous family member. To the public, these details only seemed to complicate matters. How could a man with such a history be trusted? How could someone living a troubled life be a reliable witness? But the truth is far murkier. Nick's time in rehab wasn't a mark of weakness. It was a crucible. It forged his observational skills, his understanding of manipulation, and his ability to detect patterns others would overlook. Skills that, ironically, may have kept him alive during the chaos of that night. And yet, for all his preparation, nothing could have fully prepared him for the reality he faced: two parents murdered, a secret room filled with clues, a dangerous family member lurking somewhere, and the world ready to believe the worst about him. Nick's other life, his past struggles, his rehab, his isolation, became both shield and sword. It shaped how he responded, how he observed, and ultimately, how he survived. But survival came at a cost. The world's judgment was immediate. The narrative was simple: troubled son, tragic end. Nick's nuanced story of survival, observation, and awareness remained hidden from the media until he broke his silence. Yet breaking silence introduced new dangers. By speaking, Nick exposed knowledge that could implicate others. By revealing details of the secret room, the monitors, and the observations he had made, he hinted at a conspiracy that extended beyond the immediate crime. Someone, he implied, wanted him silenced. And that someone was watching. The layers of Nick's life: rehab, isolation, creative pursuits, family tension, all converged to create a man uniquely capable of seeing the truth. But the world saw only the surface, the troubled son. What comes next, in this story, is where those observations become critical, where the dangerous family member begins to appear not as rumor, but as a calculated force influencing every moment of that night. And the audience is left asking, could Nick's understanding of human behavior, honed in rehab, be the key to unraveling the truth? Or would his past continue to cloud perceptions, keeping him trapped as the convenient scapegoat? Because what came next would reveal not just the depth of Nick's awareness, but the lengths someone would go to ensure he took the fall. What happens when a crime scene tells a story no one wants to believe? The night of Rob and Michelle Reiner's murders was not just horrifying, it was meticulously staged. Every detail, from the weapon to the smallest trace of evidence, seemed designed to confuse, mislead, and frame the person who was most visible that night: Nick Reiner. Let's begin with the weapon. The knife used in the murders was a high-end chef's knife, part of the Reiner's personal kitchen collection. It was polished, razor-sharp, and designed for precision, the kind of knife any chef or meticulous homeowner would own. Yet, despite the brutality of the attack, investigators noticed something strange. The knife bore no fingerprints. No prints belonging to Nick, and none from any immediate family members. It was as if the killer had handled it carefully, knowing precisely what to touch and what to avoid. The absence of fingerprints was not a minor detail. It suggested premeditation. It suggested someone with knowledge of forensic techniques, someone who could manipulate a crime scene without leaving themselves exposed. Next, the note. A small, torn piece of paper was discovered near the master bedroom. Initial reports described it as a hastily written apology, but closer examination revealed it was more sophisticated than it appeared. The handwriting was deliberate, carefully constructed, and partially burned, suggesting someone wanted only fragments of its message to survive. Forensic analysts theorized that the note may have been intended to mislead investigators, a red herring pointing to Nick as the culprit. Nick himself referenced the note in his recordings. He said he found it after discovering his parents' bodies and recognized it as inconsistent with anything they would have written. It was designed to suggest remorse or confession, but it wasn't theirs. And then there was the disappearance. 3 critical items vanished from the Reiner estate within hours of the murders. The master's safe, containing sensitive documents and personal journals. A collection of financial records that could shed light on motives and inheritance disputes. A personal item belonging to Nick. A USB drive with encrypted files detailing his observations over the months leading up to the tragedy. No one reported these items missing initially. Security logs were tampered with. Cameras in key areas had been disabled or overwritten. It was as if someone knew exactly what to remove and how to erase any trace. Neighbors recalled unusual activity hours before and after the murders. A car parked outside the estate, headlights off, lingering for nearly an hour. A figure leaving the property late at night, not matching Nick's description. And later, a moving van reported in the area, which some believe could have been used to remove the missing items. The timing and coordination suggested a killer who was not only familiar with the estate, but also strategic and organized. Adding to the complexity were the fingerprints found in unlikely locations. Some belonged to household staff. Others belonged to friends who claimed never to have been inside the house that night. And a few prints were unidentified, raising the possibility that a third party had been inside. Every element pointed away from Nick. Yet the public perception, fueled by the media and his troubled past, focused squarely on him. Then came the analysis of the blood evidence. While both Rob and Michelle suffered multiple stab wounds, forensic reports indicated the patterns were inconsistent with a single attacker. The distribution of blood spatter, the angles of the wounds, and the force required suggested multiple movements and possibly multiple people. Investigators began to question the timeline they had initially assumed. Could someone else have been orchestrating events simultaneously while Nick was in the guest house? Nick's own account sheds light on the chaos of that night. He described entering the house after the initial attack and hearing the sounds of someone moving with deliberate care, ensuring the scene would implicate him. He noticed objects out of place, drawers slightly open, personal items rearranged, evidence that was planted, not random. And the note? He says he picked it up, recognized it as not his parents', and understood immediately that it was intended for him. The disappearance of key items added a layer of urgency to the investigation. Without the safe, the journals, and the financial documents, authorities struggled to reconstruct motives and timelines. The loss of these items suggested a calculated effort to erase proof, evidence that could identify the true perpetrator. Nick later stated that the missing USB drive was crucial. It contained encrypted files he had compiled over months, documenting interactions, suspicious behaviors, and patterns he had observed in the household. If accessed, it could confirm his claims that someone else was present that night. The more investigators dug, the more the evidence painted a picture of manipulation, a crime designed to make Nick appear guilty while masking the involvement of a second party. And that's when the whispers began. Whispers about someone close to the family, someone with knowledge of the estate, someone with both motive and opportunity. The combination of the knife, the note, and the disappearance formed a perfect storm. A weapon with no fingerprints. A note partially burned, clearly intended to mislead. Missing items that could have exonerated Nick. The scene was almost theatrical in its precision. It was as if someone had rehearsed the steps in advance, anticipating every action and reaction. And Nick, trapped in the guest house, watched it all unfold. He describes the terror, the helplessness, the knowledge that every move he made could be misinterpreted as guilt. And yet, he also describes clarity, the realization that he had been set up, that the true danger was not just the killer, but the system ready to judge him without evidence. Neighbors would later corroborate some of his observations. Footsteps at odd hours. Suspicious vehicles. People near the estate who claimed to have business there but couldn't provide solid alibis. It was becoming clear. The night of the murders was not an isolated event but part of a larger, carefully orchestrated plan. Nick's insistence on someone else being present was not simply an excuse. It was a crucial insight into the mechanics of the crime. Insight the authorities could not ignore. But the most chilling detail? The person responsible had been careful enough to erase their digital footprint. Every phone ping, every security log, every potential trace of presence had been manipulated. The evidence suggested that the killer had known exactly how to frame Nick, knowing the world would see him first, judge him quickly, and ignore the possibility of a second party. And that is why the knife, the note, and the disappearance were more than just elements of the crime. They were instruments of deception. Nick had been trapped in the middle of it, unable to prove the truth, but aware enough to survive. By the time investigators pieced together the timeline and analyzed the missing items, the case had grown far more complex than anyone imagined. It was no longer about a troubled son committing a heinous act. It was about a calculated attempt to manipulate perception, evidence, and trust. And the dangerous family member, the shadowy figure Nick had been hinting at, became the central focus. Because what came next would reveal not just the identity of that person, but the motive so shocking it would make everyone question everything they thought they knew about the Reiner family. What happens when a family tragedy collides with an entire industry's secrets? Hollywood doesn't just make stories, it controls stories. It decides which narratives see the light of day, which are buried, and which are twisted to suit its own agendas. And in the Reiner case, that reality became impossible to ignore. The murder of Rob and Michelle Reiner sent shockwaves far beyond Brentwood. Their legacy in film and entertainment meant that every studio, agent, and media outlet had a stake in how the story unfolded. Some feared that any investigation revealing certain family secrets would tarnish reputations, disrupt deals, and even influence box office projects. Others were simply protecting themselves, carefully choosing which statements to release and which to keep hidden. Nick Reiner found himself at the center of this storm, not just as a suspect, but as a man whose insights could expose networks of influence, manipulation, and hidden agendas within Hollywood itself. Friends of the family reported an immediate media frenzy, but there were signs that the frenzy wasn't entirely organic. One producer who worked closely with Rob noted, "The coverage was too coordinated. Every outlet had the same narrative. Nick is guilty, troubled, dangerous. The truth? No one really knew yet. But the story had been set. It was almost as if someone behind the scenes had ensured the public would never consider the possibility of a frame or a second party." Hollywood insiders whispered about tension between studios, agents, and the Reiner family over projects in development. Rob and Michelle had been on the verge of finalizing deals that could expose financial mismanagement and disputes over intellectual property, disputes that certain influential individuals would have wanted to keep quiet. Was it possible that the murders weren't just personal, but intertwined with industry secrets? Nick's recording suggested it. He noted suspicious visitors, unannounced meetings, and phone calls with an urgency that seemed out of place. Conversations that seemed benign at the time now hinted at layers of intrigue, motives extending beyond family conflicts. Even the people closest to the Reiners were wary. Staff members were interviewed multiple times, often contradicting themselves. Friends who had visited the estate in previous months spoke vaguely, choosing words carefully. Everyone seemed to know more than they would say. Why? Because in Hollywood, knowledge is power. And revealing too much could end careers, burn bridges, or even put lives at risk. One startling revelation emerged from a private source. A high-profile industry figure had been seen at the Reiner estate multiple times in the weeks leading up to the murders. No public record existed of these visits. The source refused to give a name, citing fear of retaliation. Yet this detail raised questions that could not be ignored. Was the murder simply a family tragedy, or had it been orchestrated to protect powerful secrets? Nick's insistence that someone else was present in the house gains even more weight when you consider these layers. The Reiner family was deeply connected, and the forces around them were sophisticated, influential, and protective of their own interests. Hollywood's response also included what some describe as subtle silencing. Key individuals declined interviews. Emails went unanswered. phone calls were mysteriously disconnected, and early attempts to access financial records or communications from the estate were met with refusals or delays. It was as if the industry itself wanted to ensure that the focus remained on Nick, not on the complex web surrounding the family. Nick's attorneys quickly realized this dynamic. Any statement he made, any recording released, could be scrutinized not only by the authorities but also by Hollywood executives, agents, and lawyers with vested interests. They understood that the narrative was being managed and often manipulated in real time. The stakes were higher than just his freedom. They included reputation, legacy, and the potential exposure of secrets some people would kill to keep hidden. And then there were the whispers about the missing items. The safe, the journals, and the USB drive. Multiple sources confirmed that these contained